Superbugs. Now, we've been hearing about superbugs for a few decades now, and it started, as you know, back in the 70s with MRSA. But the newest kid on the block, the newest superbug on the block, is CRE. That's the carbapenem-resistant enterobacteriaceae. Did I pronounce that correctly? That one's hard to pronounce. But this is what the CDC calls the nightmare bug. It's a gram-negative bacteria, and it comprises a group of gram-negative bacteria. And actually, the term enterobacteriaceae is a misnomer because there are a few non-enterobacteriaceae that fall under the umbrella of CRE. And right here to my right, you can see one example of a super CRE. The first reports of CRE were back in 2001. And of course, as mentioned, over the last 5 years, we've seen a literal explosion of cases of CRE. What is unique and so deadly about CRE is that it can pass its formula for multi-drug resistance to neighboring bacteria. So that means that other bacteria, which otherwise may be relatively innocuous and sensitive to our antibiotics, now gain the power, the superpower of a superbug. And in some reports, there have been up to 50% mortality reported with CRE. Now you can see here, this is the latest from the CDC website, 13,100 estimated cases in hospitalized patients in 2017. So not the most up to date. There I'm sure more, but the number of deaths was 1,100. So for CRE in hospitals, it's about a 10% mortality, but that's still quite quite significant. Now, the CDC went as far as to say there is a small window of opportunity to stop the spread of CRE, and we must act now. Does that sound familiar or what? Just as with COVID, we have to act now. We have this small window to stop the spread, and the same applies for CRE. And that's one of the reasons why I agreed to give this talk, because the responsibility falls under our shoulders as endoscopists that we stop this superbug in its tracks. And I am convinced going disposable is the way to achieve that. We know that endoscopes can transmit CRE superbugs. Now, we heard of reports that dates back to 1987 when Pseudomonas was transmitted. That was a report from Minnesota, from the VA. I think it was Steve Silvis, and he reported, and Jack Venice, they both reported on the first cases of infections transmitted through duodenoscopes, but they weren't superbugs back then. The first superbug transmissions have occurred over the past 5 years. Now, here on the West Coast, I'm in California, we had a few real hot spots. I'm in San Francisco, which is one of the hot spots now, as you know, for COVID. But for CRE, the hot spot on the West Coast was Los Angeles. Both at UCLA and at Cedars-Sinai, there was a rash of cases of CRE. And then up north in Washington State, there was an outbreak at Virginia Mason with a large number of deaths. In fact, half of the patients that were infected died of CRE. So that was in the headlines almost daily. The very first report of a CRE infection from a duodenoscope was in 2013. And this sounded rather innocuous because this was a small hospital in Illinois, and it was reporting on the CRE infection due to exposure from duodenoscopes. And for the first time, they were able to trace the infection to the duodenoscope because of the molecular signature that was available, something that was very difficult, if not possible, previously. There was an infection, but you didn't know where it came from. It could have come from any source in the hospital. So this was over a 5-month period at a single Illinois hospital. 9 patients had positive cultures for CRE, and 27 additional patients colonized. Now, this kind of a report, it was in JAMA, but it probably slipped under everybody's radar. But it did not slip under the radar of the CDC, and the CDC then reported this to the FDA. Now, there have been now through 2017, so this is not the most up-to-date, but through 2017, 45 hospitals, 350 infected patients. So we are seeing a rash of these CRE outbreaks across the country. So the FDA now getting wind of this and having this under the FDA's radar now mandated the so-called voluntary, you really have to put that one in quotes, they mandated this voluntary post-market surveillance study, and they wanted this in what they called a real-world setting. Now, it's not really real world because it's mandated and it's being observed and everyone knows they're being monitored by the FDA. So that's hardly real world in my book because of the Hawthorne effect. But what they found from this post-market surveillance study, which you heard a little bit about from Betty, was that the contamination rate, now contamination rate is not infection, right? It's just contamination. It was 9%, and the expected contamination rate was 0.4%. So this is magnitudes higher than what was expected by the FDA. And the high concern organisms are those that are pathogenic. And about half of them were high concern organisms. And this clearly then got the attention of the FDA so that the FDA is encouraging MAUDE reports where any incidences of CRE or any type of contamination or infection that's known should be reported to the FDA. So this is conservative because I'm sure this is massively underreported. We have now between 2015 and 2019, over 1,000 duodenoscope infections and 79 deaths associated with those infections. But what are the real world what's the real world setting? And this is a very illustrative study from the Netherlands, a Dutch study, and it provided no routine surveillance protocols. In these centers across Holland, they did not know that they were being studied. This was merely just a survey, and 4 to 6 duodenoscope sites were cultured at each of these centers. And what they found was that 1 in 5 duodenoscopes were contaminated. So we're talking about a 22% contamination rate. 1 in 5 scopes are contaminated, and 15% of these contaminations were of GI origin. So this is in fact the real world data, that we're not even talking about 9%, which already is high, but we're talking about 22%. So you heard about double reprocessing, and probably about 50% of the centers do this. We actually are not doing the double reprocessing, but we're taking other measures to address the contamination that we can discuss later on. But this is a great study that Doug Rex did at Indiana University. So they cultured 592 duodenoscopes that had undergone double reprocessing, right? So you do the high-level disinfection twice. And what they found was that the contamination rate was almost the same as what was reported in the post-market survey that the FDA conducted, 9.4%. So then they made a change. And the change that they made, and I think this is an important change to take note of, is that they changed the pre-cleaning solution. So they paid more attention to the manual cleaning and which pre-cleaning solution they used. So previously, they were using an enzymatic solution. And then what they changed is they went to a non-enzymatic solution, a detergent solution, and it's called Intercept. And it is now considered currently, I absolutely have no conflict here with that product, but that product is at this time thought to be the ideal solution for pre-cleaning. And most importantly, it's because of the studies that address biofilm that this penetrates more aggressively into the biofilm. So we'll hear more about that, but just remember that term biofilm because it's important. All endoscopists who do ERCP are familiar with biofilm because that's why our stents clog. So they did a phase 3 part of this study where they also did spot audit checks of the cleaning personnel. So intensifying the Hawthorne effect, and there was really no difference. So the bottom line here is even if you do double reprocessing and you use the best pre-cleaning solution that's out there, you still cannot eliminate contamination. You still have a 5% contamination rate, and that's just not acceptable. So why is it that this is so difficult to eradicate this contamination? So this is another Dutch study that looked at the root causes of contributing factors. So you heard a little bit about this, and obviously the elevator is one of the culprits, but it's not the only culprit. So they looked at damage and deposits around the lever axes, the forceps elevator, the elevator screws, and they found that they were unable to reach many of the deposits with their brushes, and that they were poorly accessible for rinsing or drying. So in this upper panel here, you can see the elevator. So that's sort of obvious, right? The irregular surfaces here, the nooks and crannies everywhere that are just so hard to clean. And it would be wonderful if it were just an elevator problem, because maybe the solution would just be a disposable elevator, but it's not. So they pass these boroscopes, you can see it here, through the endoscope working channel. And when you look into the working channel, that's where you see where I think the real problem is, aside from the elevator, and that is all the cracks, the fraying, the disintegration of the lining that occurs over repeat uses. It really looks like a war zone when you look inside of the working channel. So next time you pass your spyglass probe through your duodenoscope, take time and look at the lining of the working channel. I did, and it is really quite daunting. So the problem here in the working channel, apart from the fact that you can't get there, right? You can pass your brushes through there, but you're doing very little, is that we're dealing with biofilm accumulation in the working channel. And this biofilm, you can see a cartoon of it here on the left side, complex mushroom-shaped architecture. Looks like, you know, something from deep sea diving or so, with these streamers. And what are formed are these water channels. And the bacteria, they attach, they become, they are adherent, irreversibly adherent to this biofilm. And the fluid that is running through this, it penetrates deep within the biofilm, and it actually carries the oxygen and nutrients for the bacteria. So the bacteria love the biofilm. They flourish there. That is their home. And you can see what that biofilm looks like on this electron microscopic image. I think this is fascinating. And I think this is the problem. I've known about this for a few decades because I've been working on many different plastic stent designs to address the issue of biofilm accumulation. And I've been humbled each time at how difficult it is to eradicate biofilm. It's really been impossible, right? We tried silver nitrate coating, we tried antibiotic coating, we tried all types of different types of polymers, etc., to address this, and we have not been successful. If we had been successful, we would not have expandable metal stents today. So that is proof that we never conquered the biofilm dilemma. So in April 2019, a year ago, the FDA recommended a transition to duodenoscopes with innovative designs to enhance safety. I'm quoting here, hospitals and endoscopy facilities should transition to innovative duodenoscope designs that include disposable components such as disposable end caps, or to fully disposable duodenoscopes when they become available. So this was headline news for hospitals and for endoscopists. So the writing was clearly on the wall that things must change. And they did change in December of 2019 with the FDA clearance of the first fully disposable duodenoscope. And the FDA news release is here quoting, eliminating the potential for infections caused by ineffective reprocessing. That's a nice assumption about ineffective. Ineffective because of faulty adherence to protocols, or simply because reprocessing is inherently ineffective. And I would argue it is inherently ineffective. And New York Times then, their headline here was, to prevent deadly infections, the FDA approves the first disposable scope. And the FDA said improving the safety of duodenoscopes is a top priority for the FDA. Top priority. So Raman Muthuswamy, a good friend of mine, he used to be up here in San Francisco at UCSF. He's now at UCLA. But he published this paper this year, clinical evaluation for a single-use duodenoscope. He was using the EXALT. It's a multi-center trial, 6 centers, 60 ERCPs, 7 expert endoscopists. The ERCP completion rate was nearly 100%. So the duodenoscope is able to achieve its intended application. In 2 patients, that's 3.3%, they had to cross over to a reusable scope. The median overall satisfaction score was nearly, 10 out of 10, 9 out of 10 it was. So, and there was no difference in complication rate. So this is obviously very encouraging, and we await further studies, but this was the first hurdle that we needed to overcome, if you will, because you can have the most beautiful disposable duodenoscope. If you can't complete your ERCP with it, then it's not ready for prime time. Now, let me just shift very quickly. I'm in California, so I have to, right? Ecological considerations. In San Francisco, this is what we talk about at lunch when we're eating our organic kale salad and thinking about where we're going to recycle every part of our lunch to. They got 10 different bins in different colors. So ecological considerations is obviously the big elephant here on the stage because it's hard to swallow, no pun intended here, a disposable endoscope from the standpoint of the impact on ecology, on our environment. And you can see here, I was down at Cedars-Sinai with Simon Lowe and David Carlock, and we're disposing of one of the duodenoscopes we just used, throwing it in the trash bin, and you sort of get a queasy feeling when you do that. But here's what you need to consider. That's what you see. It's what you don't see that actually may have a greater impact on our environment. It's the reusable scope disposables. So the PPE that's required, we already see this with COVID, right? The amount of PPE that we're going through now is just mind-boggling. But it's just as mind-boggling when we reprocess our endoscopes. And you can see all these containers that are required for the reprocessing. But here's the part that I am most concerned about, and it's the harsh chemicals. And one of the reasons why now I'm paying far more attention to the cleaning of our scopes, the pre-cleaning particularly, these harsh chemicals and bioaccumulative toxins get flushed down into our water supply, and it will come back to haunt us. And so you can see here that if you look at what you don't see in your daily practice, the footprint that you're leaving using reprocessable scopes is very significant, and I would argue is really more significant. We have companies out there, just surf the internet, you'll see them, that recycle medical plastics, which brings me to another topic that I think is so important that we physicians, all healthcare givers really, but in particular, the endoscopists need to pay more attention to, and that is what is happening with medical waste. We are working in our endoscopy suites like surgeons in the ORs. We contribute a whole 1/3 of the medical waste. And this medical waste, much of it gets incinerated. That, of course, eliminates various toxins into the air. And then it gets put in these landfills. These landfills are not totally contained, and they leak out, the contents leak out into our earth and into our water. So all of this will come back to haunt us. So we really need to pay more attention to the recycling of medical waste. There's really been virtually no attention paid to that. So if anything, this will stimulate or trigger greater focus on what's happening to our medical waste. And there are companies that will recycle your waste. They will pick it up for you. You put your thrown away disposable scope into one of these bins, and they'll pick it up for you, and they will disinfect it, and then they will recycle it, and you'll get your new scope made from recycled materials. That's the way it needs to be. That's the way it must be. And we must also lean very heavily on industry to work with us in partnership to make this happen. So this is just my little soapbox rant, really, because I do feel very strongly about that. All right, now cost always comes up. Well, how can you possibly afford a disposable endoscope, a disposable duodenoscope? So this is the study that was published last year at the Florida Hospital in Orlando. And for a low volume center, this is just a summary. I'm not going to go into any details here. The break-even cost for a disposable duodenoscope was $1,300. That's if you're doing less than 50 ERCPs per year. In other words, if you want to go disposable, then your disposable duodenoscope cannot be more expensive than $1,300. That's the break-even cost per their analysis, okay? Then if you're a large volume center with more than 150 ERCPs per year, your break-even cost is $800. All right, so it's come down, obviously, because you have larger volume. So you can amortize the cost of your scopes over a larger number of patients. And in the author's facility, this is Rob Oz and Shyam, a disposable duodenoscope in their calculation was 10-fold more expensive at the cost that they were using than their current cost per case. Now, I looked carefully at this paper and looked at some of their assumptions, and there are a lot of assumptions in that paper. And most importantly, they are not taking into account the hidden real-world costs. So let's start just with personnel. To clean one scope, we're talking about more than 100 steps. It's actually 150 steps. It's outrageous, the number of steps that the personnel need to go through. And it will take 76 minutes of hands-on staff time. And to do this, 150 steps obviously requires extensive training and close supervision. And there's a lot of turnover of this personnel because this is very intense work and you literally burn out from this fast. Now, what about materials? So you're talking about cleaning, storage, and all the PPE. That's not factored in necessarily, so that has to be taken into account. That's many hundreds of dollars per duodenoscope just for the materials. Not just for the duodenoscope, it's all the materials that are needed. And then there's regulatory, which in the United States is just oppressive, right? So all the inspections and audits and certifications that are needed, you need a whole middle layer of bureaucrats. That's why the administrators at the hospital, they keep adding more floors, whereas we that are in the trenches, we're told to downsize constantly. Because you've got all of this regulatory oppression that is hovering over us, and the hospitals have to meet it because they're controlled by their lawyers, by legal. And then the procedure delays when you have for reprocessing. Now everything takes so much longer now, so I'm actually waiting often for the duodenoscope to finish because it takes so much longer. And there's more repairs now. So all of this adds up, but the big item here that never gets taken into account, and you must take into account if you are a realist, is the what if costs. What if one of your patients gets infected with CRE? And what if one of the staff that you work with gets infected from that CRE? And what about the toxin exposure from all those chemicals and one of your staff members gets ill? What about the possible lawsuits that may ensue? These what if costs are daunting because you need to ask yourself, is avoiding this headline in the morning newspaper worth the cost? That this superbug infects patients at, and just put the name of your hospital in there, and that's the article, and you're not going to have a good day, nor is the CEO of your hospital or the CFO, that everyone is not going to have a good day. And these are examples of the many superbug lawsuits that are out there. And if you're up late at night like I am, then the commercials just are none-ending that are inviting patients to file lawsuits. If you had an ERCP and had an infection, you know, and even had a cold afterwards, call this 1-800 number. So this is where we are. And the question really boils down to, is safety worth the cost? And when we're talking about your safety or the safety of your family, we know it's worth the cost. You know it's worth the cost. And the automobile companies that market their automobiles know it's worth the cost, because that's why this 1930s ad here from Oldsmobile says, think twice of their safety. And all these other ads go on the same theme of safety. Now, the problem is, if it's not you or your family, then suddenly it doesn't have the same level of importance. And it's not going to have the same level of importance to hospital administrators and bean counters. And that's why Neville Shute said, everybody pays lip service to the safety of the airplane, but nobody's prepared to pay for it. So if nobody's prepared to pay for it, what you get are the pictures that you see below. And you don't want to be on one of those planes that had that outcome. So the outcome equivalent would be a CRE infection. So how do we start? You don't have to go 360 to using disposable scopes. And one of the questions in the survey that was asked, whether you would use the disposable scope in just highly selective cases, or would you consider using it in all patients? I think you could really say you would consider using it in all patients, depending on their risk status for getting an infection. Immunocompromised, whether it be that or the environment that they're living in, et cetera. Clearly, transplant patients and immunocompromised patients fit that. So I would say, yes, you start with high-risk patients, but also consider high-risk pathology like cholangiocarcinoma, or patients that have had a prior ERCP and have a contaminated bile duct, or if it's a high-risk intervention such as stenting, because we know that the risk of transmitting infections and contamination is significantly higher with stent procedures. And it's actually should be logical, because it goes back to the working channel. That working channel, it's very snug when you're putting a 10 French stent through there, and it is literally scraping that biofilm, and that's how the bugs are getting into the bile duct. Disposable endoscopes may also add additional value, and this is the part that I think, for me, is the most exciting. And that is, right now, we could take these disposable endoscopes anywhere, because they're portable in the ICU or the ORs. But for myself, suffering often from shoulder pain and neck pain after long ERCPs, Klatskin tumors, and putting 3-4 stents up there, there's a ergonomic advantage to using a lighter scope. So just not having to bear the entire weight of that scope in your hands. I helped develop the scope dock that Cook marketed many years ago, because that was one potential aid to having to hold that heavy scope in your hands the entire time. So that has fallen from the wayside, but thankfully we'll have disposable scopes soon, or we have them already, and they will disseminate. So now what's the future? The future is customizable disposable scopes. Obviously, if it's disposable, it can be customized. You can make right and left-handed versions. So, you can fill out a form and checklist and say, I'm, left-handed. So you want the left-handed version. You can have knobs of different sizes. So some endoscopists have smaller hands, some have bigger hands. And so they can select a size customized to their hand size, it makes a difference in when you're doing these long, hour-long procedures. It can be, more importantly, customizable for the procedure. So you can say, I want, a 15 millimeter channel, or I want a triple channel scope, quadruple channel scope. You can customize with the optics that you want, with the length that you want, right? You want it to be a little bit longer, then just state what that length is. You fill it out like a menu, like you're ordering something in the restaurant. And now for me, the most exciting is the opportunity for device innovation, because we endoscopists have been held hostage to the configuration of our endoscopes. It's marvelous. It's a marvelous invention. And it hasn't changed in over, half a century, which has a reason for it. But at the same time, it has held us hostage in terms of developing devices as interventional procedures have become more dominant. So now we can integrate the scope and the device. This is my conclusion slide, and there are basically 3 bullet points here. The first is reprocessing scopes is, in my opinion, inherently flawed, because we cannot eliminate the contamination and the infection risk. And if we can't accomplish that with reprocessing, then we're never going to reach the goal. The cost for reprocessing, as we try to reach that goal, will only increase. It's already prohibitive, right? But it will only go up further. So if you're going to make an investment, then it's wiser to make an investment in something that will reach the finish line. And finally, it's better for the patient, it's better for the staff, and it is, in fact, better for the environment if you recycle. So we want to underline if recycled, and that's what we need to really be adamant about, that our scopes are recycled if we adapt to this technology. So hopefully I've convinced you that going disposable is a no-brainer, and this is a cartoon showing one of the scopes that we may be using in the future, disposable scopes. Thank you very much.